Hey guys, Peter Franson here from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Despite Elex 2 being another stiff-moving and sometimes clunky experience, after spending over 5 hours with it, I was persuaded to restart the original Elex and give this franchise another try. Hang with me, and I'll explain why that is. Elex 2 is available for $60 on PC, PS4, PS5, Xbox One, and Xbox Series X and S. It's developed by Piranha Bytes over in Germany. They're known for the Gothic and Risen franchises, as well as Elex 1. It's published by THQ Nordic, who I'd like to thank for providing me with a review copy of the game on Xbox Series X. THQ's acquisition of Piranha Bytes since the production of the first Elex made me wonder and hope that Elex 2 would have stronger backing and be a more polished and high-quality release with an eye on expanding the audience for this franchise. That isn't the case as much as I'd hoped, but I might be turning into a fan of this franchise anyway. Elex 2 takes place on a world mashing together the post-apocalyptic, futuristic sci-fi, and sword and sorcery genres. All three of those. Reminiscent for me of the setting for the classic 80s cartoon Thundar the Barbarian with a dash of Mass Effect. Elex is a huge open-world action RPG with multiple classes and skill trees to customize your experience in combat, in exploration, and in NPC interactions. There are skills for ranged, melee, magic, and energy weapon combat. There are systems for lockpicking, hacking, pickpocketing, and mining, as well as crafting for weapons, armor, potions, and chems, which I think are kind of the same thing as potions. There are no inventory weight restrictions, and so I'm freaking picking up everything. I'm picking up metal scraps and flowers and monster bits and junk, and it's all useful and made more so depending on the skills you acquire and upgrade. Along with the usual combat-oriented stats are charisma-type stats and skills that will unlock dialogue options and save you money. You also have the use of a jetpack early on that allows you to fall from huge heights unharmed, kind of like turning on your thrusters at the last moment to soften your landing. It's really kind of fun to do that, jumping off of big cliffs and stuff, and it opens up some really fun exploration potential. And the jetpack can also be upgraded to eventually allow you to basically fly around at will. There are multiple game endings based on your decisions, and even as you play, the world is very reactive. NPCs will take notice and be irritated when you casually stroll into a stranger's house, or if you try to start dialogue with them when they are still talking to another NPC. There are 5 factions you can choose to join. In the first game, I believe you could only choose one, and that seems to be the case here as well. I dislike this because I prefer to go full-on mage, and the class that you choose is tied to the faction that you choose. And while the Berserker faction is treated like the magic faction in terms of the game's lore, they're actually more like fire elementals, and the spell, the spell-like ice and lightning attacks are only available in a different faction. And so I really like to be a dedicated mage with access to all the spell-like abilities and just use them in combat, but that option is surprisingly rare in many open-world RPGs and doesn't seem to really be an option here. Elex 2 is very much like the original Elex, including the rough edges, although they are upgraded rough edges. It's a bit of a mixed bag, well, definitely a mixed bag, but one I think worth considering if you're a fan of Western open-world action RPGs that are systems-rich. Piranha Bytes games are known for their lack of hand-holding and unforgiving worlds. In Elex 1 and again here in Elex 2, enemies do not scale as you gain levels. They just stay at the same power level that they're always at, and you are not even supposed to be really engaging in much or any successful combat encounters in the first few hours of these games when playing on normal or higher difficulties. However, the inclusion of both easy and story difficulty modes in Elex 2, which among other things reduce or eliminate stamina consumption in combat, yes, it is a stamina combat system, but those difficulties that reduce or eliminate stamina consumption really increase survivability for me. And as someone who dislikes brutal and difficult games but loves systemically rich Western open-world RPGs, I really appreciate the difficulty options in Elex 2. Some of you may have watched my first impressions review of the original Elex years ago when it came out, or heard my updated thoughts on the game in the years that followed when I played it on live streams a time or two. I ultimately gave up on Elex after nearly 20 hours spent in it, despite compensating for the difficulty using a cheat for infinite XP and gold. I just didn't feel connected enough to the experience given the stiffness in the combat animations in particular and the slow to react, slow to respond controls in combat that seemed to be all too delayed compared to when I was actually pressing the button. However, since then, as many of you guys familiar with my content know and have been reminded ad nauseum, I was introduced to Monster Hunter World, which with its many strengths, enticed me to develop a tolerance for slower and less immediately responsive combat controls, as well as the need to observe enemy patterns and tells and dodge appropriately. Elements of action RPG combat that I had little to no tolerance for before playing Monster Hunter World, but now I've gained just enough tolerance that it's no longer the irritant to me that it once was. That said, Elex 2 is not near as polished, nor the creature animations and behaviors near as fascinating to watch as Monster Hunter World. So, because there's not quite that much of a return on my investment for putting up with stuff, I do dial Elex 2 down to as easy as possible in difficulty, so I at least don't have to think about stamina at all while fighting. Despite combat not being impressive to watch in Elex, the world is impressive for me to look at, to move through, and to find my place in. First, let me say what is not impressive about the world. Textures are pretty solid, but now and then can look like Xbox 360 graphics when viewed really up close. Frame rate is acceptable. I'm pretty sure it's below 60 and closer to 30 FPS. I'm not sure. Voice acting is also solid, and Jax is already more interesting in his performance than I remember from the first game, although that may be because his emotions were deadened in the first game as part of the story and less so at the start of this game. I don't know. Face animations, though, are really below standard, and so you just have to be ready to accept that going into that, especially when you come off of, say, something like Horizon Forbidden West that just released, which is probably close to the top tier, the new standard setter almost, So coming off of that especially, but even compared to other games, I checked and compared them to Wasteland 3, which were pretty, not really complex facial animations. They were even of a lower quality and lower complexity level than I think the facial animations were in that game. They remind me of 90s pre-rendered animations, not in texture detail. That would be an unfair insult to compare the textures. The textures are much more complex and detailed, but the animation in complexity and realism really reminds me of 90s pre-rendered animated cartoons. I would almost describe it as cartoony if the design aesthetic weren't so serious. They're really going for a pretty drab, serious look. Even so, I did somehow adjust to the facial animations and character animations, accepting it as a sort of strange hybrid between cartoon and realistic aesthetics, almost like the first Toy Story movie, but with really realistic textures or something, The dialogue is fine, although the story itself is more interesting to me, and it may just be the faction I'm spending time with right now, but everyone is swearing like a sailor, and I'm not offended by it. It's just weird after a while how often they throw around multiple expletives into single sentences, kind of like a teenager trying to sound tough almost to my ear. It's a little weird, but every once in a while funny. Sound effects and music are largely fine. The music feels I think it's pretty synthetic, and there's not like a live orchestra or even like really convincing samples that I noticed in the score. But that's fine. It's, especially when you've got some sci-fi stuff going on, synth sounds are a little more acceptable to my ear in those environments. And it has a nice ominous or somber tone while exploring, which is a great reminder and mood setter for the post-apocalyptic setting. Sound effects often fall flat for me in this game, as they did in the first game, especially related to action and combat, where I would prefer more interesting and layered sounds. What they use here feels pretty generic and stale to my ear, and the mix sometimes seems strangely inconsistent, with the creaking of a tree in the wind suddenly feeling loud and right up in my ear, or other incidental background effects standing out more than I think they should. All that said, none of these shortcomings overtake the world itself, which leaves a really strong impression on me and keeps me coming back because of its visual design and the lore associated with that design. The particular mashup of post-apocalyptic sword and sorcery and somehow clean futuristic sci-fi is like entirely unique to my memory, not just of video games, but of any form of fiction. I've never seen this kind of mashup before. The monsters are weird and scary looking. The clothing that characters wear is often a hodgepodge, especially what you wear, is a hodgepodge of items from different cultures and fictional genres. The environments are a mashup of overgrown pavement, rusted out cars, earthy wooden settlements, and gleaming space-age vehicles. And the jetpack allows the designers to create environments with unusual verticality. On top of all that, these places have things worth putting in your pack or reading or fighting, so exploration, whether you're in a peaceful settlement environment or out in the wild, exploration is very much rewarded, and I love exploring the world of Elex 2, even though I know I've barely begun. The various factions, their values and goals strike me as being very interesting and fleshed out. I don't play games for story, and Elex 2 does not hook me with its story at all, but it has a fascinating world that I can make all kinds of choices in and watch it as it reacts to me, and I love that in an open world RPG. Speaking of story, though, it's important to note that this is not a good jumping on point for new players. I played almost 20 hours of Elex 1 before giving up, but must have only touched the tip of the iceberg, because in the first hour of Elex 2, I'm still playing Jax. You have to play as Jax in both games. There's no other option. So I'm still playing Jax, and have discovered that apparently I did a whole bunch of crazy stuff in the first game that I didn't see in the first 20 hours, and even wound up with a son that I'm now interacting with in the first hour of this game. And when it comes to the lore as well, I don't feel near as introduced or reintroduced to the world in the opening hours of this game as I did in Elex 2. Because of that, I also don't think I've yet been exposed to many of the moral or philosophical themes that Elex 2 might have. I'm always on the lookout when I'm taking in entertainment for moral, philosophical, or spiritual themes that might trigger some worthwhile thought or conversation. The opening hours of Elex 1 definitely had some striking elements, including an intense religious faction who is all about the advancement of technology, which stands in sharp contrast to how religion is usually treated in sci-fi, as being populated only by people who are ignorant and, if anything, anti-technology. So to see that being attached to an organized religion, I found really interesting in Elex 1. That same religious faction used to be violent, but for a long time had become peaceful in its effort to persuade others to convert. So just some interesting, unusual and different choices from what is normally seen in other fictional worlds. Now, those factions still exist in Elex 2, but I haven't encountered that religious faction yet, although there seems to be at least one new religious faction that either wasn't in the first game or I just didn't encounter yet in my first 20 hours of Elex 1. However, there's an interesting exchange early in Elex 2 between Jax and his son, in which Jax tried to explain to his son that this certain group of violent religious zealots that they were talking about, these zealots and these violent zealots were bad, but not bad, he specifies, because they were religious, and he seems to want to make his son aware of that. Or maybe that was just a dialogue choice that I had the option of choosing. I can't remember right now. But anyway, that's a basic level of nuance that most of us understand is often true in the real world. But in geek fiction, organized religion almost always lacks even that level of minimal nuance in its representation. So I anticipate discovering how Elex will approach these topics and themes in more creative and possibly thought-provoking ways than most other games before them. And I'm looking at you, Dragon Age and Horizon Zero Dawn. Now, at this point, I think I'm better off playing Elex 1 first. The good news is that Elex 1 has gotten some great updates. It runs at 60 FPS on PS4 Pro and PS5, and has even more difficulty options to help me out. So for both myself and others curious about this series, Elex 1 is not a huge downgrade from Elex 2. If you, for some reason, end up playing the opening hours of Elex 2, but feel lost, you'll probably find a lot to enjoy in Elex 1. Conversely, fans of the original will probably like Elex 2, but again, this is not a good starting point for new players. It's also not a good starting point for those who haven't played previous Piranha Bytes games. But then I don't know that any of their games are. It would have made such a difference in my attempted playthrough of the first game for a notice to pop up saying something like, Elex is not like other RPGs you may be used to. Considering those significant differences, here are some tips for your first 5 hours of play. As it is, Elex and other Piranha Bytes games seem content to cater mostly to the fans they already have, which I think is a shame given some of the really unique things that Elex in particular as a franchise has to offer. If you'd like to see, if you'd like what you see in Elex 2 coverage and reviews, my recommendation would be to get Elex 1 heavily discounted because it's a mixed bag and it's a risk. It might end up not being your thing. But I mean, if you can find it for $10, $15, maybe even $20, then I think it's worth the risk if what you see and hear about Elex 2 sounds good to you. If the challenge intimidates you, know that in Elex 1 you can dial the difficulty way down, and that XP and money cheat still works. I just confirmed that last night and can be easily found explained online. That said, I've restarted a playthrough of Elex 1 with some difficulty options I didn't have the first time I tried it, and so far I've not died once, and I may not even feel the need to use that cheat, which is exciting because I don't like dying, but I do like to feel my character becoming more powerful and able to take out enemies that once greatly threatened them. And so I'm looking forward to having something closer to that type of experience with my second attempt playing through Elex 1. I'm in a very different place than I was when trying Elex 2, or different place trying Elex 2 than I was compared to when I tried Elex 1. I've been trained in some ways by Monster Hunter's more deliberate combat, and I'm also really hungry right now for a systems-rich, open-world Western action RPG. That's a very specific combination of things, but that is what I want right now, and here's Elex, and it's giving it to me. And the world of Elex really couldn't be much more my cup of tea than it is. Now, there are those other issues that make it clunky and below standard in a number of ways. So maybe in a week I'll feel different. Maybe what is striking to me now is going to just feel like old hat after playing this game for a month. Maybe the things I tolerate today will have me uninstalling it next week for all I know. I don't know. Stay tuned. I will almost certainly give my updated thoughts on the Christian Geek Central podcast as I return to Elex 1 for another try, and we'll just find out together what happens to me in that. But right now, I think I might be the right gamer, and Elex 1 and 2 the right games to make for a clunky but a really fun time for me. I'd love to get your thoughts in the comments below. Please like, share, subscribe, click that bell to stay connected. Summer Insanity is coming. Check the details below for more information, and I hope that you will check out the Christian Geek Central podcast and all other CGC content at christiangeekcentral.com as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. Summer Insanity.
Liberate butter.